We've been conditioned to see love as a seismic event, a narrative of grand gestures, of obstacles overcome through sheer will.
I will stand with you between the heavens and the earth. I will tell you where you are. Do you love me?
I love you!
Our stories tell us that a love worth having is a love worth fighting for, with a passion that burns so brightly it's impossible to miss. But there are other stories too. They don't show us love through these grand gestures or through romantic sweeps, but they show us love through the quiet pauses of life. An example can be found in The Lunchbox, where we meet Sergeant, a widower on the verge of retirement. His life is framed in muted, sterile tones. His apartment is a space of blues and grays, functional but devoid of warmth. We see him on a crowded Mumbai train, physically surrounded by people, yet a solitary figure in a frame. The visual composition here isn't about Sergeant being alone, but about him being solitary, a man existing outside the vibrant, interconnected world around him. He's simply waiting for his life to end. His life is a repetition of files, meals, and smoke breaks. His loneliness isn't just spoken, it's framed. Notice how the camera places him at the edge of the frame, swallowed by his office, or in shots where silence is heavier than the dialogue. Then we have Sa, where Ratna, a young widow, works as a living maid for a wealthy architect, Ashwin. She too is a solitary figure, but her loneliness is a direct result of her social status. The camera captures her in the small, cramped servants' quarters, a stark contrast to the sprawling, minimalist luxury of Ashwin's apartment. When she is in the main living space, she is often placed at the edge of the frame, a ghost in the background of Ashwin's life. For Ashwin himself, his loneliness is a different kind of prison. His life is defined by a broken engagement and the cold, unfeeling perfection of his modern home. The shots of him sitting alone in his vast living room, a solitary figure against a backdrop of clean lines and empty spaces, speak volumes about his internal emptiness. The story structure of both films begin with profound isolation. The protagonists are not just single, they are existentially alone, even in a sea of people. Both films use a deliberate observational camera to establish this emotional landscape. The initial scenes aren't just exposition, they are a visual and atmospheric portrayal of people in a state of quiet despair. Love in these stories doesn't start with a grand gesture or a chance meeting. It starts with a simple breach in the system. In The Lunchbox, the breach is a mix-up in Mumbai's famous efficient Dabawala service. The lunchbox, meant for someone else, arrives at Sergeant's desk. In a moment of pure serendipity, a tiny crack in the rigid routine of his life. The love begins with food. The camera lingers on the delicious, lovingly prepared meals, a visual manifestation of Ila's care and emotional state. The first note Ila slips in is almost functional. When Sergeant receives it by mistake, what could have been an awkward error transforms into a dialogue. The mundanity of the salt is too much, and how was the food evolves into something more intimate. In Sa, the breach is even more subtle. The love begins when Ashwin, in his state of emotional breakdown, starts to see Ratna not as a part of the household furniture, but as a person. The camera shifts from wide, sterile shots to a more intimate frame, focusing on their faces, their eyes. A conversation about his broken engagement becomes a moment of shared vulnerability. A turning point isn't a dramatic event, but a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in power dynamics. Ashwin asking Ratna about her life, and her calmly, respectfully answering breaks the invisible barrier between master and maid. The genius of both films is that love isn't something that happens to them, it's something that they both build. It's a slow, intentional process of peeling back layers of a person, one note, one conversation at a time. And in these stories, the emotional bond is established long before there's any physical attraction. As the connection deepens, so does the conflict. And it's a conflict rooted in guilt and social convention.
आंटी ये थोड़ा अजीब नहीं है ये चिट्ठी विट्ठी
For Ila in The Lunchbox, her growing affection for Sergeant is a source of internal turmoil. She is a wife, still in marriage, and her letters to Sergeant, filled with hopes and dreams, feels like an act of emotional infidelity. We see her expression of guilt in the close-ups of her face, a mix of excitement and anxiety as she writes each new note. She knows the world would condemn her for this secret connection. In Sa, the guilt is perhaps more explicit and socially loaded. For Ratna, a romance with her Sa would be a violation of 1,000 unspoken rules. She is not a modern woman who can date her boss. She is a maid whose very survival depends on her respectability. For Ashwin, the guilt is twofold. He feels shame for a failed engagement and now a forbidden attraction to his employee. The film portrays it with scenes that are physically and emotionally tense, a lingering gaze, a shared smile. Each moment feels loaded with the weight of social disapproval, a silent judgment from a world that would never understand. We see a subtle but important moment when his friends, in their casual conversation, reveal their classist assumptions, and Ashwin's is visibly uncomfortable. The people around them serve as a constant reminder of the world that they are operating in. Ila's passive husband, her well-meaning but oblivious neighbors, Ratna's friends, who want her to be careful, and Ashwin's friends, who cannot conceive of such a relationship. The film don't need a villain. The antagonist itself is the society with its rigid classic structures and expectations. Notice how both films let guilt breathe, silence, pauses, unfinished sentences, and characters hesitate more than they act. And in those hesitations, we see the depth of their humanity. But love, as subtle as it is, begins to gradually change them, and this is where the emotional narrative becomes a visual one. In The Lunchbox, Sergeant's world starts to lighten. He is no longer the man in grey. He smiles more. He strikes up a conversation with his young colleague, Sheikh, and for the first time, we see him as a man with a sense of humor and life. The camera captures these moments with more warmth and light. The Lunchbox itself is a vibrant pop of color in his otherwise sterile office. The gradual change in Sergeant's demeanor is a testament to the power of a connection built on simple kindness. Similarly in Sal, Ratna becomes more vibrant. Her ambition is no longer a quiet hope, it's a real, tangible plan. She is given a sewing machine, a symbol of her independence. She now has a new sense of purpose and dignity in her posture. She carries herself with a quiet confidence that was not there at the beginning. Ashwin too begins to transform. He is no longer a passive victim of a broken engagement. He takes actions, not just for himself, but for Ratna, using his privilege to help her achieve her dream. The love they have for each other doesn't make them want to stay in a relationship, but it makes them want to be better, to be truer version of themselves. The characters are not striving for each other, but are inspired by each other to strive for their own self-worth and happiness. And this brings us to the most powerful and most unusual part of both films, the open-ended endings. These films defy the conventions of the genre and refuse to give us a simple answer at the end. In The Lunchbox, they plan to meet, but Sergeant, when he sees Ila from a distance, chooses not to reveal himself. He sees her for the first time, beautiful young woman with a future, and he steps back. He understands that a romantic relationship between them with their age and class differences will be an impossible burden for Ila, so he steps back. This is an act of selfless love. The final scene shows Sergeant going back into the city, possibly to find her, or possibly not. The love story isn't over. It simply moved beyond the confines of the traditional narrative. It's a type of love that exists in the space of what could have been. In Sa, the ending is even more resolute. Ratna chooses to leave her job. She understands that while Ashwin's love is real, it's also a prison. A relationship with him would mean giving up her identity and her dream to become a fashion designer, to be seen as more than a maid. One of the final shots is a shared look between her and Ashwin, a look of understanding, respect, and a quiet sense of loss. But it's not tragic. The love between them has not ended. It has simply matured into a different form, a form that allows them to move forward with grace and dignity. Neither of these characters is in a position to be the protagonists in a typical romantic drama. They are defined by their quiet existences and their lack of a grand romantic narrative. And yet, love finds them not through a chance encounter at a glamorous party, but through the mundane, the routine, the everyday. For Sergeant, it's a lunchbox mistakenly delivered to his desk. For Ratna, it's the quiet professional exchange with her employer. In both films, the love that grows is not about physical attraction, it's about an emotional connection forged by mutual respect and a deep sense of loneliness felt by these characters. They are not looking for a savior or happily ever after. Instead, they are looking for someone to see them, to acknowledge their worth, and to share a part of their soul with. The love in these movies is a sanctuary, a quiet refuge from the disappointment of their lives. For Ila, it's an escape from a loveless marriage. For Sajan, it's a reason to wake up each morning. For Ratna, it's a validation that her dreams are not insignificant. And for Ashwin, it's a connection to the reality outside of his privileged world. Both films show the immense social barrier that stands in the way of these subtle loves. In The Lunchbox, the love is kept a secret, an exchange confined to the anonymity of the notes. They can talk about their lives, their hopes, and their affairs, but they can't cross the physical and social boundaries that separates them. When they finally have the chance to meet, Sajan, seeing Ila from a distance, decides to run away. It's an act that seems to contradict everything we've been taught about love stories, but is the ultimate act of quiet love. A selfless decision to protect her from the pain and complications that a relationship between them would inevitably bring. He knows he can't give her the life she deserves, and in that moment, he chooses her happiness over his own. Similarly in Sa, the love between Ashwin and Ratna is fraught with the impossible tension of their class differences. The romance is a direct violation of societal norms. His friends are shocked. His family would be appalled. Ratna is keenly aware of this. She knows that a romantic relationship would be a trap, a temporary happiness that will eventually lead to more pain. So, she decides to make the difficult decision to leave. This isn't a dramatic breakup, but a calm, resolute choice to prioritize her own path. She chooses her dreams over a romance that, no matter how genuine, could never fully be. This is the central paradox of these films. The love is real, but it is not all-consuming. It doesn't demand the sacrifice of one's identity or dreams. In fact, it helps these characters move towards their self-actualization. At the end of The Lunchbox, Sajan, inspired by Ila's letters, is no longer the man waiting for retirement. He now has a new purpose, a new hope. He decides to seek her out, not as a desperate romantic, but as a man who has been changed by a subtle connection. And in Sa, Ashwin uses his connection to help Ratna get a job with a fashion designer, giving her a real chance to pursue her dreams. The romance is over, but the support, the respect, and the love remain. The Lunchbox and Sa both challenge our perceptions and assumptions of love. They remind us that love doesn't have to be a loud, ambiguous pursuit, that it can be found in the quiet moments, in the shared glances, and in the simple everyday acts of care. The endings of both films refuse to give us the easy satisfaction of a typical romantic comedy. Instead, they leave us with a quiet sense of hope. The relationship may not have a traditional conclusion, but the characters' lives have been transformed by each other's experience. In a world that often measures love by its intensity and success by our ambition, these films offer invaluable alternative perspectives. They suggest that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones that are quiet, gentle, and utterly unassuming.